from Northern Arizona University. And so I want to kind of tell you about what we're talking about, give you an outline of this talk. So I'm going to be telling you about information about the plants and soils that we have here in Moab and how cool they are and everything that's going on with them. I'm going to talk about what happens when they get disturbed, when somebody goes off trail or someone drives off trail, and what happens to the plants and soil crusts that we have. Why it matters on a small scale, and then also why it matters on a large scale. How long it takes to recover. This is the #1 question I get asked when I tell people I study Biocrust. Everybody wants to know how long it takes Biocrust to recover. So we'll talk about it. And then I'm going to talk about how climate change kind of throws a wrench in everything, and how and the impacts that climate change have on the desert that we have here in Moab. Okay, so I want to start by kind of situating us on the landscape. So here we are down here in this lower corner in the valley. Everyone should probably recognize this. Here's the Colorado River, and some things to take away is that it's really red here. There's a lot of exposed rock. There's not a lot of green, and it's beautiful, and you can see out my window. I wish we were outside right now. It's beautiful, and then, you know, what's really the take-home message about Moab is it's dry. It's really dry here. The reason there's not a lot of green is because we just don't get a lot of rainfall. And to kind of put that in perspective, so Moab gets about 10 inches of rain each year. And that is, if you were to hold a sheet of paper up, this is about like 11 inches. And so this is more rain than we get in a year, most years. And to compare that, someplace that's super green, if you could think of like the greenest place that you can be, the Amazon basin, they get 80 inches of rain a year, and that's the size of a queen size mattress. So that just puts us into perspective of just kind of how little rain, how little precipitation we get here in Moab. And so that dryness really ends up shaping the landscape. It really shapes how the plants and soils look out in the desert. And so here's a picture. It's kind of grainy because I took it 10 years ago when I moved here on like one of those old disposable cameras. And this is from Arches, so looking towards the La Salles. And really what I want to point out here is that here there are, in the foreground here, there are these kind of discrete bunches of plants. And so, you know, here's a plant, here's a plant, here's a plant, and then there's this soil in between. And so, you know, we have this non-continuous canopy. So, you know, it's not like when you're in a grassy area where there are, like, you know, there's grass that's just a continuous cover of grass. We don't have that here. We have plants, and then we have soil in between, and then we have another plant. And that's because it's dry. You know, we can't, you know, the amount of water that falls can't support a continuous covering of plants. And so we have this unique aesthetic in our desert. And what that's ended up evolving is some really interesting, cool plants that are really adapted to surviving this dry place. And so, for example, our prickly pear cactus that most of you are probably familiar with, they have these cool spines, and these spines are actually, they used to be leaves in evolutionary time. What happened was the leaves are just losing too much water to the atmosphere, and so cacti over time, their leaves turned into spines to you know, counteract the dryness that happens in deserts. So super cool. Cacti, they have a lot of other adaptations that allow them to withstand this dry place. Similarly, our beautiful Indian rice grass, which is a bunch grass that I'm sure you've all seen out in the desert. It's got that cool kind of tuft at the top, and those seeds, those little black seeds. They're pretty cool because they're only green at certain times of the year. And so they're greening up right now. If you've noticed, we can see the leaves on the Indian rice grass starting to grow again. But in the summer, these grasses turn brown. And so when you think summer, you think grass, right? But not here. They evolved to not be green during the hottest times of the year, so they cannot lose as much water. And then blackbrush is kind of a similar story. Blackbrush is the kind of rough looking shrub that we have pretty common throughout the Moab area in the landscape. And what they actually do is they drop their leaves during the hottest part of the year. So similar to back east, where during the fall, the deciduous trees, they lose all their leaves. Well, instead of that happening in the fall for the blackbrush here in Moab, that happens during the hottest times of the year. And so these plants are tough, and they're really well adapted to a difficult to live in place. And the same can be said, the same is true for the soil coverings that are in between these plants. And so that's our biological soil crust. So you can see them in this picture. Everything around this blackbrush is biological soil crust. And so if we zoom in on our crust, you might know them as cryptogamic crusts, or cryptogams, or biological soil crusts, but I call them biocrusts because that's what the cool people are calling it these days, a shorter biocrust. And so that's what you'll hear me call it, because I'm trying to be cool like them. So the biocrust that we have here, they're a layer of lichens, mosses, fungi, and cyanobacteria, and algae sometimes too, that live on the soil surface. So they live in between plants, and they are about 2 centimeters deep. And they're just this really cool community that lives on the soil surface and kind of binds the soil together. So here's a really cool cross section that I really like of biocrust. It's clearly a diagram, and it just shows that, there's depth to this crust that we have. You can see here that, there are mosses, there are lichens, these are sand grains that you have, and then we have these cyanobacteria that are kind of winding all through the crusts. And so if we look at this picture, it's kind of, it's mirroring what we're seeing in this diagram. And so here is a lichen. It's hard to tell, but I promise it's a lichen. These are cyanobacteria that are making these pinnacles. These are all sand grains here. And then these little black dots here are the mosses. So just like if you were flying your drone or in your airplane, looking down onto a forest, you can kind of see that, we can tell, because we're used to looking at forests and plants more often, that these are different species. This is a tree, this is maybe a shrub. You can tell that there's some other stuff going on in here. Well, the same thing is true for biocrust. So when you're looking down onto biocrust, I'm 5'8", so if I'm just like looking down from that distance, I'm looking down onto multiple different species, just like you're looking at different species when you're looking down into a forest. So it's something cool to consider that a lot of people maybe aren't always aware of when they're looking at biocrust and just thinking like, oh, it's black dots, black bumps on the landscape. There's actually a lot more going on. There's really cool communities that are involved there. And so what are these biocrusts doing out in the desert? Well, they're really holding the soil together. So like I showed in that first picture, the plants are kind of spaced out, and there's a lot of open space in between those plants. And what's covering that is the biocrusts. And if the biocrusts weren't there, it would just be soil. It would just be the soil underneath the biocrust that, would have nothing really holding it together. And so this is a picture showing, this is the top of the biocrusts, and all of these are these cyanobacteria filaments. And so these kind of, sticky filaments that bind together and really kind of glue the soil in place so that it really is this protective covering. Here's a picture I got to take with a cool microscope camera. And so what you're seeing here is this is a sand grain. And again, these like hair string things are the cyanobacteria that are kind of winding around the sand grains. And what they're doing is they're holding the sand grains up against gravity. And so I love this picture because it just shows how strong they are, that they're able to like hold, these things that are much bigger than them up and really hold them all together. And so just like plants, these biocrusts are really evolved to this place. And so the reason that some of the crusts are dark colored is because they have these pigments that allow them to withstand the sun. So they are protected against UV, and they can go dormant when they don't have a lot of rain. And so they're really well adapted to this dry desert. And so they're tough. like to think of them as super tough little critters. And so something I want to point out early on is that there are different stages of biocrusts. And so maybe, you know, sometimes you see pictures of this cool, beautiful, pinnacled biocrust, but a lot of the times really what you're seeing is something that looks like this, where it's just like maybe some textured soil that's like, you know, looks like maybe the color of sand or something, and you're just like, I'm not really sure what's going on here. Well, this is also biocrusts. It's just that biocrusts kind of develop in different stages. And so just like in a forest, if the forest were to burn down or get clear cut, it's going to be a succession of different species that come back. So maybe the first thing that's going to come back is going to be some of these little plants. I don't know forests. I don't know, but you know, some early species that are shorter, and then maybe you're going to get some medium height trees, and then maybe, you know, then you're going to get this beautiful big forest again over time. Well, the same thing is true with biocrusts, where here early on you kind of get just these cyanobacteria that are coming in and kind of holding the soil together. And then a little bit later over time, it becomes a little bit darker. You're starting to see more texture, more topography. You start getting more mosses later on. And then eventually you get these really cool pinnacled biocrusts. And the reason our biocrusts are pinnacled like this, or are up and have these like kind of mirror the canyons around us, right? If you've seen a really big pinnacle of crust, is because of freeze thaw. So over the winter, the cyanobacteria that's holding it together freezes and then thaws and freezes and thaws, and actually kind of pushes itself up into a really cool biocrust pinnacle. So that's why they're like that. But so it's a succession. And so these are biocrusts and these are biocrusts. And just to really bring that home, because I think this is really missed for a lot of visitors who don't really recognize that most of the time when they're going off trail, they're stepping on biocrusts. And so this is biocrust here, all of this that you're seeing, this is biocrust trying to become this dark, beautiful, pinnacled biocrusts. And so as long as, you know, we let this be, it will one day turn into this, which is really cool to know, and just really emphasizes why it's important to be able to recognize those different types of crusts. And so, you know, one thing that I like to tell people when I'm trying to get across the importance of these biocrusts is that they're like coral reefs. And so people really kind of resonate with the idea of coral reefs because they know that they're beautiful and important to the ecosystem. And the same thing is super true with our biocrusts. They're beautiful, they're colorful, they're important to the ecosystem. And so it's a nice way to introduce people to kind of a concept that maybe is pretty foreign to them if they've never been in a desert before. Oh, and I finally figured out how to look at the chat. So if you guys do have questions, yes, Maddie, I'd love to share these images. Yep, Biocrust is the new crypto. Cool, so I've just been talking about how strong and evolved and awesome our biocrusts are here in the desert. And so it might be kind of confusing as to why our biocrusts always look so afraid. Here are some signs showing biocrusts, and you could tell these poor things, like, I love this one, like they're just terrified out here in the desert. And there's a good reason for that. And it's because they evolved to be really tough to withstand our environment, but they did not evolve to be really tough when they get stepped on, right? So they're really strong horizontally, but they're really weak vertically. And so they can't withstand what we call compression. And so that's anything like a footstep or a bike tire or a car tire or, you know, big grazing animals. They just didn't evolve to withstand that kind of pressure. We have some animals here that have hooves. You know, we have deer and bighorn sheep and, you know, mountain lions and stuff, but we didn't, the ecosystem didn't evolve with a lot of like pressure, downward pressure, right? It's not the Great Plains where they had a million bison hooves everywhere. We just didn't have that here. And so biocrusts are really weak to compressional forces. And to really kind of show an example of that, here is a super cool cross section of biocrusts. And so here is our biocrust layer on the top. Here's the surface of the biocrust on top. And here's what it looks like if you were to kind of slice the biocrust in half. Don't do it, but this is, someone did it for science, it's okay. And so, oh, this got moved a little bit, but really what you see here are these open spaces in the biocrusts. And so those are just air. They're like not really anything. They formed when like I said, the frost heaving was kind of moving the particles all around and moving the cyanobacteria up and down with the freeze thaw. And so these kind of holes in the crust formed, and it makes it really weak. So it makes it really, really weak compressionally, even though again, it's strong horizontally. And so when we were trying to think of an analog for our biocrusts and how they're pretty weak on the inside, one of the amazing members of the Science Moab team noted that like this cross section of biocrust kind of looks like meringue, which are those desserts. I don't know if you've had them, but they're like these kind of soft, airy desserts that some people love. And it's super true. And so here's what they look like if you've never seen them. They're also pinnacled, just like the biocrusts. And then they also have this kind of airy middle. These kind of airy middle sections, just like the biocrust. And you can imagine if you've ever had one biting into it, you can kind of feel that that airiness. You can feel how hollow it can be sometimes on the inside. Yeah, I love them too, Laura. And so, we went down a long Google train into meringue to try to get some of these images, and we came across the most amazing video ever, and it shows what happens when you crush meringue. And so someone made this beautiful meringue pie and they decided to crush it, and it's just the perfect analog to what happens when you step on crust, because we didn't want to take a video of stepping on crust, but we found this meringue instead. And so what I want you to note is that as this dessert gets crushed, its whole structure kind of breaks apart, right? And there's going to be no rebound. So the whole thing's going to crush and there's not going to be any kind of bounce back. And the same is going to be true for biocrust. And also I just want to emphasize that we did not put this music in. This music came with the video and it's pretty great. Okay, so we can watch it. It's short. Amazing. So that is what is happening when biocrust gets stepped on. The whole thing is compressing, the structure is breaking apart, and you're not getting any kind of bounce back. And so the integrity of the whole thing is lost, and that is what's happening with biocrusts. And so what does this really look like on the landscape? We've all seen it. We've seen what happens when this integrity of this crust layer is lost. And here is a bike tire that's gone and over into the crusts. Here is somebody's footprint. And so the whole structure that had been held together is broken apart, and what's left is just soil. And so all that's left here underneath what the crust was is soil, and the crust does not have the ability to rapidly reform and come back together. And so you're breaking the integrity of something that's really important, meringue or crust otherwise. And I'll get to your question later, Laura. I do like everyone's LOLs though, because I also love that video. And so what else does that look like? Well, this is what it looks like with tires. And so it's an even bigger impact than a single footprint or a single bike tire. Car tires leave even larger tracks, and the larger the track, the more integrity is lost of the biocrusts. And so here's somebody who drove through our beautiful dark crust, and it's very sad always when you see it. But I also want to emphasize that this is driving through crusts too. And so you can really see in the soil here that there's like a very clear imprint of the tire. You're usually not going to get that when you're driving through a wash. Like sometimes you'll see that if there's not Biocrust, but usually when there's like a crisp outline of a tire track or a footprint, that usually implies you're in crust. So again, this was that early crust trying to become the late crusts. And so this matters too, because we got to give it the chance to become that later crust that is more stable and more able to, you know, provide services for the desert. And so, you know, when people start going off trails, biking, walking, you know, one footprint, okay, whatever, but like the problem becomes when it gets more than that. And so here are a bunch of footprints, right, that have clearly gone out into the desert. And this is in Arches, heartbreakingly. And here are Blackbrush again. And so you can see that people have really walked everywhere, and you really don't see any kind of real big evidence of a crust covering here. And this is when it really starts to become problematic, when one person sees a footprint and they follow it and they go out to an area and really start trampling this whole bigger region. And just as like a visual reference, you know, this has every potential to be this. It's just not. Sometimes it's easy to forget when you're out there and you're seeing it. You're like, oh, it kind of looks healthy, kind of looks like it's intact, but really like this is what we're going for. This is the crust that is providing the most stability and providing the most nutrients and services for the ecosystem. And so, you know, as people continue to migrate off trail, and as people, you know, park in different areas or, you know, create just more dispersed campsites, the impact just keeps getting bigger. And so what happens is the crust gets crushed and it starts breaking apart. It causes dust, and that just keeps getting, the footprint of that keeps getting larger until you get this kind of large exposed area. And what you're really just looking at here is soil, right? There is nothing holding the soil together anymore. And so we know, living in this desert, that there's a lot of intense rain that can happen in our monsoon season, and there's also a lot of intense wind that's about to start. And so what happens to the soil? Well, it gets blown or washed away, and it can get washed away into kind of into our water areas. It can, you know, kind of sediment load our riparian areas and our streams and rivers. But for the purposes of our talk today, I'm going to focus on what happens when it gets blown away and the soil that used to be covered in crust becomes airborne. And I just want to emphasize at this point, before we go farther into it, that dust and blowing soil isn't quote unquote natural to this desert here on the Colorado Plateau. It's not the Sahara here, right? It's not historically a sandy or a dusty place. So it's just something to think about as we continue to talk about dust and soil that gets airborne, that it's always a result of disturbance. It's not necessarily inherent to this desert ecosystem here. So I found this video again on the internet, and I was like, sweet, we're gonna use it. It's this guy, thank you, person, for letting us use this video, flying a drone, and he's out, this is King Creek, and so he's out flying his drone, and he gets caught in a sandstorm or a wind event that has a lot of dust going on. And he has to park the drone on the ground because it's getting pelted with blowing soil, with dust. And what it captures is the amount of sediment that's moving over the soil surface. So, you know, when we're out and it's windy and it's dusty, and there's soil blowing everywhere, we're like, you know, however tall, again, I'm 5'8", so I'm 5 feet 8 inches above the ground. And it's not always clear to me how much soil is actually moving along the ground surface. So there's a lot more that can be moving along the surface than is moving kind of at my height. And so this video kind of captures what's moving exactly at the soil surface. And it's a lot more than we maybe had realized in the past. So I'll show the video, and I want you to focus on the amount of soil that's moving over this poor guy's camera. super bummer for that dude. But you saw there was a ton, and maybe when you're standing and you notice that it's windy and dusty, you're not being pelted in the face by some of those soil particles, which are kind of big. So it's just important to think about, when we're talking about erosion, we're talking about a lot of soil that could be moving when there's not biocrust or plants to hold it together. And so this becomes a problem. And so when this soil is being moved and there's no biocrust to hold it, what you start getting is this really large scale erosion. And so this picture was taken on the dump trail. This is in right hand, and this picture up here on the top is in Arches National Park. And what you're seeing is a lot of people have been walking in these areas. They've been walking all around these plants and kind of disturbing the soil crusts and the vegetation that would have been there. And we've lost all of the soil. So this is where the soil used to be, right? This was the layer. And then this is everything that has since eroded away. And so what you're seeing here are roots, right? You're never supposed to see plant roots. It's just like generally speaking, not great for the plant. And so, this is pretty problematic because the plants aren't going to be able to withstand having their roots exposed like this for much longer. And so the impact just kind of keeps growing. And so these roots that were holding the soil together before now aren't going to be there either. And there's just going to be more soil exposed that can blow or wash away. And so here is here's another picture in Arches National Park, and you can see that people have been walking off trail up this kind of slope area here. And here we have some shrubs that are the same things happening as you're starting to get these roots exposed and you're starting to get erosion here. And so, just to reemphasize, underneath this, everything is just sediment. It's just kind of loose sand in this picture where we're looking. And to just give you an example of the amount of sand that can be moved. So there's this guy who posted this photo on Instagram last week, and I saw it and I immediately messaged him and I was like, oh my God, can I please use this photo? Because it's such a good example of the amount of erosion that can happen in the parks. So here's Sand Dune Arch in Arches in 1985, and here is where the sediment was then. And then here's the same spot in this year. And so you can see this huge amount of soil was moved out of this area. And so it was moved by wind and it was moved by water. And so this is the potential of this region to lose this amount of sediment. And so this area that I was just showing you, if people keep walking here and keep kind of exposing this soil and these plant roots keep getting exposed and disturbed, eventually this has the potential to turn into basically a sand dune. And then, once that sand dune is exposed and nothing's really holding it in place, this is what can happen. I could all just leave this system. So, the effects kind of start to amplify. So these are kind of all the smaller scale effects, but then you start taking that to this larger scale. And so here is Sand Flats. Here's the road to Sand Flats. This is the Lion's Back area. If anybody goes there, I walk my dog there all the time. And so this area was heavily disturbed by vehicle traffic in the past, and it has since been blocked off. So it's not, people aren't driving over it anymore. But what you can see here is that this process of turning into a sand dune and then losing all that sand, that's what's happening here at a bigger scale. And so this light, you could see these little dots, these are all the plants that are remaining, and this here is just exposed soil. And so it's turning into kind of almost like a sand dune here against the rock. And you could see that it's expanding. And, if you've been out here, it's like these big sand dunes. It can be very dusty. It can be very windy. It could cause a lot of problems. And so this is just going to keep growing over time, unless something radically changes or we go in and we stabilize the soil. It's just going to keep growing because it's in this kind of feedback loop. And so if you're out there, here's a picture I took, here's my dog. I stitched two pictures together, that's why they're not perfect, but this is that area. And so you can see all of this exposed soil, and you can see these tall mounds of shrubs that are not really what this place would have looked like before kind of larger scale disturbance happened. And then if we want to zoom out again, here's a Google Earth image of Johnson's Up on Top. And what you can see here in these lighter colors are these sand dunes that are starting to form. And so, you know, out here along the rim, you're getting, because of historic disturbance and also dust accumulating on the rim up here, you're starting to see these lighter colored dunes forming at a large scale. It's kind of crazy to think about how this is happening. It's actually happening quite rapidly. And it's literally because we're just disturbing the soil surface. And so here's what that looks like. You could just see again, all of this exposed sand that's feeding back on each other. Okay, how are we doing? Is this all making sense? Can I get some chat confirmation that we're on the same page and everybody, is anybody completely lost? Yes, I got one yes. Yes, dogs definitely have an impact. I have a dog and I'm guilty of walking my dog in places, but yeah, it's a problem. Anything you know, pushing down the soil is going to disrupt the crust for sure. Okay, great. Yeah, right. Big deal losing all that soil and that sand dune arch. It's pretty crazy. Okay, so I've just explained how we get these, you know, these kind of big sediment exposures that are happening out here around Moab in the desert. And so then the next logical question is kind of, where does all of that soil go? Where does all that dust go? And it turns out it goes into the air. And it goes into the air in sometimes really big ways. And so here is a picture. Oh, I forgot the date here, but this was a few years ago. Mike Dunaway at the USGS published some work on related to this picture. And what you're seeing here is a highway north of town, and you're seeing a dust storm. And so there was a, somebody's unmuted. If someone could mute themselves, that'd be great. So what you're seeing is dust that's kind of just covering everything. You can't see. And there actually had been some fatalities on the highway because of these dust storms. And these dust storms are a direct result of the soil disturbance that's kicking up large amounts of dust during our spring winds and just, you know, it's blowing through the air with the wind and really reducing visibility and causing problems. It also goes on to cause health problems. You know, you don't want to be breathing this stuff in. And we're seeing an increase in dust storms here in Moab and across the American West, to be honest. And so these were not part of the historic Moab. You know, there weren't dust storms pre, you know, settlement of this area. And so sometimes, you know, during those dust storms, what's happening is also that dust is getting higher in the atmosphere and it's actually getting blown all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And so that's kind of like the big obstacle, you know, our winds go from, you know, the south to or from, you know, the Gulf towards the Rockies. And so the dust kind of from Moab hits the Rocky Mountains and it leaves this covering of kind of our red dust on the snow. And what happens is it changes how quickly the snow melts. So if you've been out in the desert with in a black shirt, you know that you're going to be a lot hotter than if you were out in a white t-shirt. And it's because the black t-shirt captures more heat, holds the heat from the sun. And the same is true with the snow. And so when this darker color lands on the snow is not as white. The snow gets hotter faster and then it melts faster. And actually what we're seeing is a 30-day increase in when runoff begins. And so runoff is happening 30 days sooner because of dust from our area landing on the snow in the Rockies. And that has huge implications for how much water is entering into the Colorado River system, because 90% of the water in the Colorado River comes from these mountains. And so it's changing when water's going into the system and how much runoff is happening sooner. The soil's not able to retain water as long. Our river seasons could be earlier and potentially shorter, and your ski season is also shorter. So just like bad news all around. Not good. We don't want this to keep happening. So figuring out how to keep people on trail is like a pretty big deal. And the other thing is people come here to visit this beautiful place and look at the views. It's the main part of our economy, right? It's visitors coming to this area. But when there's dust, the viewshed can be diminished greatly. And so here's a really striking example down at Indian Creek. Is one of the six shooter peaks here. And the Kenya Lands Natural History Association and the USGS has these like view monitors, like these cameras there that take pictures, and they captured this picture. Here's a picture of that area on a beautiful day, beautiful sunny, clearish day, and then here's that same exact picture during a dust storm, and you just can't see anything. And so it has big implications. And so if these keep happening continuously, it's going to impact what people come here to do, which is to look at the pretty rocks. So yeah, big scale problems. Okay, so, that was a ton of information. I talked to you about plants and about soil. I talked to you about what happens during disturbance with our meringue, why it matters on a small scale. We were talking about, sand dune arch and all of that erosion, and then why it matters on a large scale, which is this huge problem of dust regionally. So the next two things I'm going to talk about are how long it takes to come back, both if we just leave it alone, but also kind of the restoration stuff that people are doing with vegetation and with biocrusts, and also how climate change is kind of impacting this and what we might see into the future. And so I'll do a quick check-in with the questions. It looks like, Bridget, a lot of it is historic. So Bridget asked, like, what's the big contributor to these dust storms? And, in the past, a lot of it had been overgrazing. And so the landscape had been pretty disturbed because there had been a ton of sheep and a ton of cattle in this area that really broke up the soil historically. But increasingly, off-road vehicles and just visitation is causing a lot of dust. And so, trail widening and just like the large number of roads that exist in our region and just people driving over them, even if you're staying on trail, you're kicking up dust is kind of the sad reality. And so it's a lot of different factors, but as the area kind of changes from, kind of historic, agriculture, grazing, to now we're seeing these larger impacts of roads and visitation, it's something to really consider that these impacts can be very large. Does that make sense? Let me know if that made sense, Bridget, and we can follow up if not. Okay, so how long does it take to recover? Let's situate ourselves back here. This was all kind of sad, but we're going to talk about recovery. So we're in Moab, it's beautiful. Life is worth living. Let's talk about restoration. Okay, after a disturbance, does anybody have a guess about how long it would take for plants to come back after a disturbance in our desert? If you do, let us know. Mark knew right away. The answer is that it varies. It depends. It really depends how long it takes for plants to recover after they've been disturbed. And so if you, I tried to find like an exact-ish answer, even though it will depend. There are a few different resources that kind of give us an idea of how long it takes for plants to recover after they've been disturbed. A lot of these are examples that come from grazing, and so these are studies that have looked at plant recovery after grazing in the past, but there are also some studies that have looked at well pads, and so can give an idea there. So this is data based off of the BLM, and so after an area has been disturbed in some capacity, the BLM requires that the area be restored, or whenever there's a restoration project on BLM that's trying to get vegetation back, their kind of requirement is that the vegetation come back to 70% of normal. And so normal might be like what it was before it was disturbed, or, you know, what some kind of neighboring site looks like. And so it needs to be about 70% of that. And so some sites, if there's like really good precipitation, really good rainfall in a few years, some plants can regrow within a year. So it can like look pretty similar, but of course it's going to depend on the type of disturbance, the area of disturbance, all those things. The BLM estimates that most sites that they were trying to do restoration in recovers in 5 to 10 years, which is kind of a long time, 10 years to restore something that didn't probably take very long to disturb. Is a pretty significant amount of time, especially considering the impacts that I just outlined and how soil erosion is a feedback process. And then some sites that the BLM have seen can take up to 20 years to recover. And just to emphasize this, so I moved here 10 years ago, and this area was blocked off way before then. I don't know the exact date, but this is again that area on the way to sand flats with those dunes that I was describing. And so this has been about 10 years, and even though people are still walking there and their dogs are still running there, it's not being disturbed like it was, but it's still not recovering. And so that's been about 10 years, and we're not really seeing any kind of real recovery like we would want to see, you know, a flat surface where with plants growing on it. We're still seeing dunes, and we're not seeing vegetation in the inner space. And then somebody mentioned that yes, like a lot of other things depend on how long it takes to recover. So things that are on a north facing aspect will recover more quickly. Things that get places that get shade will recover more quickly. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of, it depends. But generally speaking, we're looking at, you know, half a decade to a decade for recovery. And so again, I'll ask you how long it takes for Biocrust to come back. And I know you will know that the answer is it depends, but I'm curious what you've heard. Like, I know some people who tell me like, oh, Biocrust comes back in a year. And some people will be like, it takes thousands of years for Biocrust to come back. So, oh, thank you, 2004. Yeah, so it's been a long time since that area was fenced off. Has anybody heard some kind of time frames for how long it takes Biocrust to recover? I'm just curious. 100 years. Yep, I think that's a pretty common one that I've heard multiple times. And what I'll do is I'll explain like, yep, okay, that seems to be an average. I'll explain kind of where these numbers come, 250 years, 1 to 250 years, yeah. There's a diagram that has 250 years on it. I know the exact one that you're talking about. So the answer, of course, is it depends. And it depends on 50 to 100. Yeah, it depends on a lot of different things. It depends on the type of disturbance. It depends on the soil type. It depends on how much rainfall an area got. It depends on things like aspect, north facing, south facing, all these different, you know, elements.
It does work up here for day use. Are you doing day use or camping?
Yeah,
I just muted whoever that was, sorry. So yeah, so it really depends on a lot of different factors. But one estimate that that maybe you've heard that kind of makes the number pretty big, some of these 250 to 500 to 100 year estimates, a lot of them come actually from this really cool experiment that was done in the Mojave Desert based off of General Patton. So here's General Patton, who was a World War II general, and he had his training grounds in the Mojave Desert. And so here are his tanks in the Mojave Desert. And here are his tank tracks. And what you see in between the tracks is biocrust. So this was a biocrusted area until General Patton and his tracks came down here, or his tanks came down here to practice their war maneuvers in the desert. And so scientists Jane Belknap and Steve Warren went out in 2002 and tried to measure how much biocrust had recovered in these tank tracks. And what they found when they got there was that the biocrust actually had not recovered. And that's because the weight of the tank makes it so that the ground was so compacted that the biocrust could not come back. And so using what they knew and using, you know, some models that incorporated climate and soil type and varying other things, they made an estimate that the biocrust in this area wouldn't come back for 1,000 years. And so this is the most extreme number related to biocrust recovery, but this is where it comes from. It comes from pretty interesting science done by our local scientist, Jane Belknap, saying that, you know, this is the max amount of time that we're seeing for recovery. But there are also some estimates that are more related to our area here in Moab. And so here is a experiment that had happened near Island in the Sky, and near iSky. And they, the scientists and technicians went out and they trampled the biocrust for science to ask like how long it takes the biocrust to come back. And so all the scientists would, or, you know, all the technicians would huddle together and like kind of like walk side by side, crushing the crust. And I know because I was one of them. A horrible feeling crushing all this crust. And what happened was you ended up with these plots where you could really see where the biocrust has been disturbed versus where the biocrust is together, or, you know, not disturbed next to it. And so scientists then, you know, measured how long it was taking these biocrusts to come back, and also kind of what happened when you crushed all this crust. And so kind of when you compile all of this information and think about it, and when you look at the different estimates of from this region, and including that study I just talked about, what you get is a single footprint. So if you are like, if you go and you just like put your foot in the crust, which you shouldn't do, it takes about 3 to 5 years to recover. And recover means like that full, cool, pinnacled crust. So not that early, like you'll see, you maybe won't see your footprint maybe in a year if it's been a rainy year, but it won't be, you know, back together in a real way with that dark color for 3 to 5 years probably. And then it can take multiple decades with a vehicle track here on the Colorado Plateau. Interestingly, you know, this data comes from compiling 33 different studies from around the world, because biocrusts exist around the world. And the average time for recovery was 28 years globally. And just to bring that home, again, it's a succession thing. So recovery depends on where you're talking about on the successional sequence. And so if someone were to go and put their footprint in the crust, maybe in 1 year, it might look like this, you know, but it's going to take 5 to 10 to longer to really look like this really nice pinnacled crust with lichens and mosses and everything in there. Does that make sense for the recovery times? People have questions. I'm going to talk about restoration next, but I just want to make sure that everything's clear if people have outstanding questions. You can let me know in the chat. Doesn't look like it. So if anyone does, just let me know. 3 to 5 or 5 to 10. It's a good question. Probably like, it really depends. I mean, I think 3 to 5 for a single footprint, depending on what crust you're in. 5 to 10 for this like bomber crust. If you were to step on this pinnacle of crust and you wanted to look just the same, I would say it would take on average 5 years, but it's going to depend on the amount of rain and different things. So we have a comment that some species are endemic and they may never come back if they are destroyed in one area. That's really interesting. There are species that are unique to certain soil types. And so like I'm thinking about gypsum. If you've ever driven down towards Cane Creek, and if you look like kind of as you're turning that bend to go along the river, along Cane Creek, there's this gypsum soil. It's kind of that gray soil, and it's got super crazy cool lichens and species of crust on it. I definitely recommend checking it out if you've never looked. I think that if you destroyed that whole area of gypsum, the crust would not recover there, because there's not like species that could come back easily because you've just destroyed the whole area. But I don't know a ton about, like, I haven't heard a lot about like crazy endemic species that only exist in like one area, and if you destroy them, they're gone forever. But it is worth thinking about that crusts exist. Different types of crust exist in different places, and some can be more fragile than others, and some can be more, you know, discrete and vulnerable to disturbance. in different areas. But feel free to follow up with more questions if you have questions about that more, Leslie. Okay, so now I want to talk about Biocrust restoration. So, 5 to 10 years, 3 to 5 years. I think that it is not fast enough for most people. A lot of land managers want that to go a lot faster. And so scientists have really been working hard to try to do biocrust restoration. And so that involves growing biocrusts in the greenhouse and then trying to take it out into the field and get it to take and restore and start stabilizing the soils. And so here is a picture from an experiment at Northern Arizona University where they grew biocrust in the greenhouse, and you could see it does that same kind of successional trajectory where it goes from light to dark. And here's what that grown biocrust looks like. So it's really cool. We can grow biocrusts in the greenhouse when you give them water in really nice conditions, which is exciting. And here's like taking that into the field. And so, they've sprinkled this biocrust that they grew in the greenhouse into these plots and wanted to see if it could recover. Unfortunately, it's not doing as well in the field as we had wanted, as scientists had wanted it to. It's not growing as effectively or as quickly as we had hoped, but there are some positive signs that, taking this greenhouse grown biocrust and putting it out over time, once we figure out the right methods, might really be able to restore areas that have been disturbed. And there's actually there has been a really cool effort at Mayberry farms out near the Colorado River that have been growing large-scale crust gardens to be able to use in restoration, which is really cool. And as far as I know right now, there are at least 3 active restoration projects that are trying to take biocrusts and restore it into the landscape by having grown it and then put it back out. So pretty cool. Moab is kind of leading the way in biocrust restoration and trying to address some of the problems that have happened with disturbance. But, all of this is kind of overshadowed by climate change. And so here in Moab, Utah, we're actually a hotspot for warming. And so this is showing the amount of warming, the temperature change from, if you look at the period of 1901 to 1960 versus 1991 to 2012, there's been about a plus 2 degree Fahrenheit amount of warming on average here on the Colorado Plateau. So that's like pretty significant happening in real time. So this is not like a future projection. This is like what we've already seen, the warming we've already seen on the Colorado Plateau. And we know that actually really isn't great for our biocrusts and for our vegetation. And so there have been some really interesting experiments that the USGS has done here around Moab, where they actually heated the soil and the plants to ask what happens when you when the air temperature is warmer and when you change the amount of precipitation. And what they found is that it's not great. And so here is an area that was not given any treatment. It was just left alone. And here is an area that was warmed and was given altered precipitation. And what happens that you might expect under climate change, and you really see that you lose a lot of the biocrust. And then another experiment, I'm going a little fast because I'm realizing we're almost out of time and I want to leave time for more questions. So feel free to follow up on some of these if you have more questions. But here's another experiment that the USGS has been doing where they monitor an area that has never been disturbed. So it's never been grazed, it's never been walked on, it's never been, the biocrust has just been intact for as long as the scientists know of. And what we see is in this never disturbed area, here is the A is in the same place for reference in each photo. From 2004 to 2019, you're actually seeing this die-off of biocrusts, and that's because of climate change, and that's because of warming in this area. It's actually negatively affecting the biocrusts, as far as we can tell. Warming or changes in precipitation. So this is not great. The plants are actually more resilient, the scientists have been finding, to these climate changes that are affecting our area. So that's great news. But really the reason I'm telling you this is because it's always important to talk about climate change, but also just to really emphasize that disturbance and climate change together are a really big problem for our ecosystems. And so making sure that we are doing everything possible to mitigate disturbance on the, on the footprints, on the vehicle traffic, on, the bike tires, is going to allow these organisms and these ecosystems to be more able to withstand climate change. Because when you pair one on top of the other, it gets really hard for our ecosystems to stay intact. So it turns out our steps really do matter. This sign is real. Hopefully I've expressed that to you. Hopefully you believe me and don't, this is not fake news. The science is really there to support that. It's very important that people stay on trail. It's very important that these big areas aren't disturbed out in the desert. And so what can we do about this? Leave No Trace has a lot of great recommendations for how to talk to your visitors or your clients or visitors about this. Some of the main principles that Leave No Trace offers is really like planning ahead so that people can know that they can't get through certain areas because these areas are full of biocrusts, and you should really plan ahead so you can know where the trail is, or know where there might be a route on slick rock, or know where the washes might be, so that you don't have to just cross country through these open areas. And then really staying on durable surfaces. And so staying on those trails, staying on the slick rock, camping on durable surfaces, not walking in washes, don't camp in the washes, but yeah, those kinds of recommendations. If we could really communicate that to people more and more, don't take a selfie, don't like walk off trail to take a selfie, just stay on the trail, and really communicating to people why that matters, I think is the way forward. Our amazing AmeriCorps Vista intern, Sophia Fisher, put some quotes together to try to have light, effective ways to communicate to people about not walking on the crust. My favorite is, if you're not in a wash, put a kibosh on it. So I really like these, communicating that if you feel kind of a crunch or leave a sharp footprint, you're probably walking on crust and you probably should turn around. Okay, so yeah, communicating this to visitors, communicating the implications of walking off trail to visitors, I think is the way forward. And so I just want to put a plug out there. Science Moab is developing a science certification for guide companies and organizations that interface with the public. And so this is going to be a 1 to 2 day training about science relevant to the places that guides bring their clients. And it's going to start being offered this fall, and it's really meant to extend on this talk and talk about all sorts of other amazing science topics relevant to this region, so that people really understand how this place works and the implications of their actions, and how something that might seem small like a footprint can have large scale impacts. So with that, sorry I rushed towards the end, but I recognize it's getting close to being done. I want to open it up to any questions, and also I encourage you to follow Science Moab on Instagram or Facebook. Email the organization if you have any questions about what we do or the science certification, or email me specifically if you have questions about my talk today. Thanks again to the Hotspot team in Arches, and now I'll stop sharing, and I'd love to know if anybody has any questions. Thank you, Lauren. Oh, yeah, so we have a question about, is plant hopping still a thing? Yeah, so tiptoe through the crypto is kind of an idea that, you can kind of step on plants instead of crust. If there's like an area where there's a lot of crust and you need to get across it, you can kind of hop from bunch grass to bunch grass. I mean, yeah, I would say do that if you have no other choice. It's not super, there's not a lot of situations I've been in where like there's literally no slick rock anywhere that that you can't direct people towards. I mean, sometimes if you're really out there, and then in that case, yeah, I would step on the plants rather than the crusts. And I want to emphasize, it's not just that, like, yes, when you step on when you do one footprint on the crust, like, it's heartbreaking, sure, but like really what happens is once you see once somebody sees a footprint in the crust, then somebody else wants to go there too, right? It's that feedback loop. That's kind of like this theme in this talk, is that there are these big feedbacks. And so once you have one footprint, then you have another, and then you get a trail, and then you get dust, and then that trail widens, and these things that we all know about. And so, yeah, plant hop, walk on surfaces, just don't walk in the crust as much as possible. I have another question. How does dust affect intact biocrust? That's a great question. And so what happens then is, especially along the sides of trails, dust gets kicked up and it lands on the biocrusts and it actually buries them. So, you know, they're photosynthetic organisms that rely on getting sunlight, you know, to be alive. And so when you have a bunch of dust landing on the biocrust, it buries the dust. And that's actually the process of trail widening. So it gets wider because the crust next to the trail gets buried, and then that dies and becomes soil, and then it just continues to happen. And so trails can get wider that way. Great question. Anything else? Any other follow-up questions?
Hey, Christine, I have a quick question. This is Carrie.
Yeah.
So because we have a lot of backcountry rangers here, and often we want to mitigate this proliferation of footprints and off-road tire tracks, what would you recommend as the best way to sort of camouflage that or cover that up so that it doesn't promote other people following in those tracks, to, you know, support not impacting the surrounding area, if that makes sense?
Totally. Great question, Carrie. So the first thing that comes to mind, I mean, you know, I think you all are probably just as much of an expert as me being out there and doing the work, but I got to do some research putting down slash pieces, so like branches, out in a desert area, actually in Bandelier, in the backcountry in Bandelier National Park. So like they had a bunch of junipers die, and so we cut down those junipers and put them out on the landscape, those like branch pieces, because what actually happens is when you put those branch pieces out, it creates kind of like a microclimate for plants to grow. So seedlings tend to germinate, sometimes seedlings you don't want, like cheatgrass, but also sometimes plants. And so, you know, if you have an area where someone's been walking, or you're trying to close an area, it could be effective to put some kind of branch or something, which I know we're branch limited here in the desert, but some kind of branch, and then potentially put out native seeds, so like rice grass seeds. And so you can kind of create this microclimate for the seeds to germinate in, and really make it so that it's not a place where people want to walk anymore. I don't know how feasible that is for you and for people in the backcountry. It's a lot to carry around, but it's probably would be the ideal way to do that, is to get some vegetation to grow along the side of an area where people have been walking. Does that make sense, Carrie?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Mark asked about stepping flat versus tiptoeing. I mean, I think it's a little bit semantics, you know. I mean, you want to leave the less impact. You know, tiptoeing might have more of a force, so you might break up the crust more, but you know, flat might be just like a bigger footprint that's more visible to people, that other people might follow. I mean, I think I would suggest just saying, don't go on it ever. Don't tiptoe, don't step on it, like walk around. You're almost always going to find even the smallest wash to walk through. But Barg, I'd be happy to discuss the minute specifics there. We have another question comparing soils to coral reefs. Soils can be analogous to plankton in the ocean in terms of carbon capture abilities. So biocrusts do sequester carbon, just like any growing thing. You know, we have the biocrusts are mostly made of cyanobacteria, and cyanobacteria, you know, take in carbon. And so, you know, it's being sequestered into the soil and sequestered into the bodies of the biocrust. And so, yeah, there's definitely carbon sequestration going on with the biocrust. There's a lot of really cool science that Dr. Sasha Reed is doing at the USGS about the role of biocrust in carbon sequestration. It is complicated because biocrust is such a thin layer compared to the soil. So if you measure carbon flux, I'm going to get real nerdy sciencey on you guys for a minute. If you measure the carbon coming in versus going out, there's a lot of carbon that's lost from the soil, and there's not a ton that's taken in by biocrusts. And so the math is that an area of soil maybe loses more carbon than it holds, but it depends on, like, if you're talking about the thin little layer of crust or the deeper soil. So it's a complex topic, and I encourage you to reach out to Sasha Reed at the USGS if you have more carbon sequestration thoughts, because she's kind of the queen. There are more questions, Carrie. If we need to stop, just kick us off. Otherwise, I'll just keep answering questions. Is raking or sweeping tracks still good to help fix a disturbed area? Gosh, it depends question, I think. If you think that someone is going to come and if you think that someone's going to come and walk on those tracks, or think that those tracks are a trail, or where the bike route should go or something, then I would say yes, you should sweep them so that the area so it doesn't encourage more traffic. But if it's an area that is unlikely to have more people coming, I would not rake when possible, because you're just creating a larger disturbance. When I see if I see a footprint somewhere, I will take very gently kind of just rub out the track print to try to camouflage it. It's the best I could come up with. So I think it depends, but you really just want to think, in whatever situation you're in, what's going to disturb the least amount of area, both now and in the longer term. What is the recommended method to cover a social chair or tire tracks, debris? It's suggested to take disturbed crusts and move it back. Yeah, I mean, again, these are great questions. I talked about it a little. I try to cover visual impacts to discourage more people from walking in those places. The crust will recover if it's left alone, right? And so if we could leave it alone, it'll come back for sure. But I think, well, not for sure after our climate change discussion, but it'll try to come back. But to cover a social trail or tire track, I would just, yeah, whatever, maybe a broom. I mean, whatever method you have to try to reduce the visual impact without disturbing more soil area, if that makes sense. I think it's going to be context dependent a little bit. And if a crust gets disturbed, I do move it back. I move it back and I put it up. I put it right side up whenever I see it. It's not always feasible in big scale disturbances. But yeah. Okay. Anybody else? I've talked for a long time. Question about dust and local hydrology. Does it impact evaporation rates? Dust and hydrology. I mean, the dust is landing on water, and it's impacting soil quality. And so we're seeing increases in phosphorus in waterways in our region because of dust. So phosphorus is a nutrient in the soil, and it's picked up and moved, and it lands on bodies of water. It gets washed down when soil's eroding through water during erosion events, and phosphorus ends up getting in the waterways and causing algal blooms. Actually, pretty interesting cutting edge science on that. But Samara, we'll have to talk more about evaporation rates. I'm not exactly sure what you mean there. Maybe you're thinking of a dust on snow analog, but we can talk about that. Send me an email and we'll talk more. Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? I know it's getting kind of late, so we can cut it off at any time.
I have a question.
Please.
Yeah, so this one might be silly, but is there another reason to avoid camping in washes besides possibly getting drowned out? Is there another reason?
No, it was about not getting caught in a flash flood.
Okay.
Yeah, good call. I mean, there might be, you probably shouldn't, there's going to be a really interesting talk on human waste. later this
Yeah.
week, so you don't want to leave human waste in a wash, clearly. But yeah, it's mostly about don't camp there because of flash floods.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're
Christina,
welcome.
I have a question.
Yeah, Maddie.
Maddie. So you have some great photos and visual aids for showing people like what Biocrust is at its different stages, and how it relates to like coral reefs or these other things that people are maybe a bit more familiar with. Is there a resource you can recommend for other folks, like for me in the county or the different land management agencies, where we could find some similar photos or resources?
It's a great question, Maddie, that multiple people have brought up. There used to be a website that had a lot of these resources that has since gotten taken down because the website host it's a long story. No, the answer is no. There's currently an international effort to have a repository of Biocrust photos, but that includes Biocrusts from Germany and Spain and Israel. So there'll be cool stuff there. But anybody out there, the park, the county, anybody, this is something that that we can do. It's with Science Moab is kind of create a repository resource for everybody. We would just need to figure out funding to make it happen. But until then, everyone should feel free to email me if they need photos, and I can definitely get a lot of these, some of them were stolen from the internet, but a lot of them were my own photos because I'm pretty into it. So
Great.
Yeah, just let me know, Maddie.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, question from Michael. Advice on ways to successfully interact with visitors to the public lands that are doing the bad things, but either don't realize it or aren't concerned. It's a great question. That's not my bag. you probably all are way more of an expert on interfacing with the public than I am. I talk about the science and try to communicate it to the people who do interface.
So Christina, I'll just add really quick. Michael, if you're available tomorrow, the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics is doing a presentation that's going to address this specifically, that I think will be very beneficial. It's effective communication of Leave No Trace, and it's tomorrow at 1 o'clock, from 1 o'clock to 3. So if you have a chance to join in on that, that would be great. Otherwise, I would recommend looking into some of the resources that Leave No Trace offers, such as Authority of the Resource. And they have an amazing website that has a lot of resources to help with that. So if you can join tomorrow, that'd be great. If not, I would highly recommend looking into some of that on their website. And it looks like they are dropping in the chat some links right now.
Thanks, Carrie. And I'm coming to that meeting too, or that presentation too. So I'm excited about that.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you, Christina. I think hopefully everyone here learned a ton. I know I did. And thank you guys for joining in. It really makes it a better much better, great presentation to have all of you here interacting and asking questions. So hopefully, if you have additional questions, you can connect with Christina. But again, thank you so much, Christina, for doing this amazing presentation. And thank everyone else for joining in. And hopefully we'll see you at the remainder of the sessions this week.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank everybody.